The high-end car dealership gleamed under the midday sun, its sleek windows reflecting a world of luxury and exclusivity. Inside, polished marble floors stretched beneath rows of pristine vehicles, each one a masterpiece of design and engineering. The air smelled of new leather, a subtle reminder of the wealth and status that filled the space. It was a world where only the privileged could truly belong. But for Marcus, a black man in his early 30s, this world was a challenge he had always known he would have to face. Marcus had worked tirelessly to build his career, rising through the ranks of a tech company with grit, determination, and an unwavering belief in his own potential. His success had not come easy, nor had it been without its share of struggles. There had always been barriers, subtle, yet powerful forces, that sought to keep him out of spaces like this. But today, as he stood at the entrance of the dealership, he felt a quiet sense of pride. He had earned his place here. His latest success, a lucrative contract, had granted him the opportunity to finally purchase the luxury car he had always dreamed of. It was more than just a vehicle. It was a symbol of everything he had overcome, of the years of late nights, self-doubt, and overcoming obstacles that had once seemed insurmountable. Marcus adjusted his suit jacket and took a deep breath, pushing aside the familiar nerves that had always accompanied these moments. He had been to fancy places before, but this one was different. The glistening cars, the staff in crisp uniforms, it all seemed a bit too polished, too perfect. As he stepped inside, the cool air of the dealership greeted him, and he was immediately met by a salesman, a tall, sharply dressed man with a stiff smile. The salesman's gaze lingered just a little too long on Marcus, his eyes scanning him from head to toe. It was a look Marcus had seen many times before, one that was too quick to judge, too eager to dismiss. The salesman's greeting was perfunctory, his tone polite but distant. "Can I help you, sir?" The words were right, but something about them felt off. Marcus hesitated, sensing the unspoken barrier that lay between them. The walls of the dealership, so pristine and immaculate, suddenly felt as though they were closing in on him. The initial warmth he had felt at the idea of finally stepping into this world began to dissipate. He was not just another customer here. He was an outsider. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. The expectations, the assumptions, the unspoken judgments. They were all too familiar, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that this would be different. This time he would not let the world dictate his place in it. He had come too far for that. But deep down, Marcus knew this was just the beginning of something that would test him in ways he had not yet imagined. Marcus followed the salesman deeper into the showroom, trying his best to ignore the sense of unease creeping up his spine. The salesman's overly formal demeanor felt more like a barrier than a greeting, a silent signal that Marcus was an outsider in this space. As they walked past rows of luxury vehicles, the gleaming surfaces of the cars reflected in Marcus's eyes like distant promises. They were beautiful, yes, but they also seemed untouchable, like they belonged to a world where he didn't belong. The salesman's name was Stephen, and though Marcus tried to keep the conversation light, Stephen's responses were curt and devoid of genuine warmth. "What are you looking for today, sir?" Stephen asked again, his voice colder than before, as if he had already sized Marcus up and found him lacking. "I'm interested in the X5, Marcus replied, his voice steady. He had done his research, studied the specifications and the reviews. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he wasn't about to let the man's attitude throw him off course. But Stephen's smile seemed to falter at the mention of the car model. His eyes flickered briefly to the price tag, then back to Marcus, before he gestured vaguely toward the far corner of the showroom. "Sure," Stephen said, but his tone was dismissive, almost as if Marcus didn't truly have the means to afford the car. "I'll show you the selection." The phrase felt like an obligation more than a choice, as though Marcus were an inconvenience rather than a potential customer. Marcus followed him, trying to ignore the tension in the air. The quiet but ever-present sense of being judged for something he couldn't control, the color of his skin, was not a new feeling, but that didn't make it any easier to endure. He had faced it before, in meetings with colleagues who underestimated him, in stores where he was followed by security, in restaurants where the service was slow, and in countless other places where his mere presence seemed to challenge some unspoken order. But this was different. This was a dealership that was supposed to be about customer service. about understanding and meeting the needs of people who had the means to invest in the finest things. They stopped in front of a silver X5, one of the most expensive models in the lot. It was polished to perfection, its sleek curves gleaming under the bright lights. Stephen glanced at it, then back at Marcus, his face betraying no emotion. But Marcus could sense something else in his demeanor, a kind of reluctance, a silent judgment that lingered between them. "Beautiful car," Marcus said, trying to break the ice, though he already knew that he was being judged before he even had the chance to show his interest. Stephen nodded slowly but didn't offer any additional commentary. "It's a solid choice," he said flatly. There was no enthusiasm in his voice, no effort to make Marcus feel welcomed or excited about the car. Marcus felt a pang of frustration. He had been through this before. Disengagement, a cold reception, the subtle nudges that made it clear he didn't belong. Yet he refused to let the salesman's dismissive attitude take away from his purpose. He had worked hard for this moment, and no one, no matter their prejudices or assumptions, would take that away from him. He asked to take the car for a test drive. Stephen's eyes briefly narrowed, and Marcus felt a shift in the air. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. "Let me check with my manager first," he said, then turned sharply and walked toward the back office, leaving Marcus standing alone in front of the car. The moment felt like an eternity, the cool silence around him amplifying the sting of rejection. Marcus stood still, staring at the car, but his thoughts were elsewhere. His pulse quickened, the frustration rising within him. Was this how it always had to be? Did he have to fight for every inch of respect, every ounce of dignity, just because of the way he looked? He had dreamed of this moment for so long. He had imagined walking into a dealership like this, being treated with the respect he deserved, enjoying the satisfaction of finally acquiring something that symbolized his hard work and perseverance. Yet here he was, in a place where he was not only unwanted, but made to feel as though his presence was a disruption. The seconds dragged on, and Marcus fought the urge to walk out, to give up on this dream, but he refused to let Stephen or anyone else dictate his sense of worth. He had worked too hard, faced too many obstacles, and overcome too many challenges to let this man, or this moment, rob him of his self-respect. It was a test of his patience, of his resilience. He was determined not to give in to the feeling of being less than, not to let this dealership's unspoken biases get the best of him. When Stephen finally returned, the expression on his face said it all. He was still wearing that tight, forced smile, but this time, Marcus could sense the true contempt underneath. "I'm sorry," Stephen said, a slight smirk in his voice, "but I'm afraid the test drive isn't possible today. We've had an issue with scheduling and—" Marcus cut him off, his voice calm but firm. "I've come here with the intention of purchasing a vehicle. I'm not here for games or excuses. If you can't show me the car, I'll take my business elsewhere." Stephen hesitated for a moment, clearly surprised by Marcus's defiance, but he quickly regained his composure and gave a small nod, as if Marcus's words were nothing more than a minor inconvenience to him. "Of course, sir. Let me see what I can do." The air between them was thick with tension, and Marcus knew that this was no longer just about buying a car. This was about standing his ground, about refusing to let his worth be dictated by someone else's prejudices. And yet, there was still a part of him that felt the sting of what was happening. It wasn't just about the car. It was about a system that was built to exclude people like him, to make them feel like they were never enough, no matter how much they achieved. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Marcus stood in the showroom, waiting for Stephen to return with any sort of update. But deep down, Marcus knew that this moment wasn't about the car anymore. It was about a larger truth. A truth that had followed him throughout his life, even in the face of his successes. He had worked so hard to prove that he belonged, but all it took was one glance, one moment, to be reminded that some people would never see past his skin, never see him for who he truly was. When Stephen returned, he was no longer pretending to be the courteous salesman. His expression had shifted to one of indifference, and his words were carefully rehearsed, as if he had delivered them countless times to people like Marcus. "I spoke with the manager," he said, his voice flat. "Unfortunately, it seems that we're unable to move forward with the test drive. The car has already been reserved for another customer." Marcus felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. The reservation was an obvious excuse. He had been to enough dealerships, enough places, to know when someone was giving him the runaround. He could see through it, the thin veil of politeness hiding something far more insidious. This was about more than scheduling conflicts or availability. This was about the fact that Marcus didn't fit the profile of the ideal customer. His skin color, his presence in a space so steeped in wealth and privilege, it was all too much for Stephen to accept. For a moment, Marcus stood frozen, the air thick with frustration. But something inside him snapped. His body tensed, and his hands clenched into fists, not out of anger, but out of a quiet, determined resolve. The years of fighting against expectations, of pushing through barriers placed in his path by people who had already made up their minds about him, those years had led him to this moment. And this time, he wouldn't back down. He would not let this man, or anyone like him, dictate his future or define his worth. "Let me get this straight," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "You expect me to believe that a luxury car like this one, in this condition with no real reason to deny me, is unavailable? You don't have a single car in this showroom that's available for a test drive." Stephen's eyes flickered, and Marcus saw it then, the briefest flash of hesitation, the mask beginning to crack. But Stephen quickly masked it, adopting that same practiced smile, though it seemed less convincing now. "It's not about availability, sir. It's just company policy." "Company policy?" Marcus repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Don't insult my intelligence. You've decided that I don't belong here, haven't you? You've made up your mind about me before I even walked through that door, and now you're giving me excuses." For the first time, Stephen seemed uncomfortable. He shifted on his feet, clearly thrown off balance by Marcus's directness. He glanced toward the front of the showroom, perhaps searching for the support of his colleagues or his manager. Marcus had them cornered. The weight of what was happening began to sink in for Marcus. The car dealership, this polished, glossy space where wealth was on display at every turn, was just another reflection of the world he had fought to succeed in, a world where his worth was constantly measured by standards beyond his control. But Marcus had already crossed that line. He had reached a place in his life where he had nothing left to prove, and it was a power that gave him an unshakable confidence. "I don't need you to tell me what your policies are," Marcus said, his voice steady now, almost as if he were speaking from a place of clarity. "What I need you to do is stop pretending that this is about anything other than your personal biases. I've been to enough places to know how this game is played, but I'm done playing." Marcus turned, his decision made in that instant. He was no longer interested in purchasing a car from a place that held so little regard for him. It wasn't just about Stephen's behavior. It was about the system that allowed it to persist. He had fought too long for respect, for equality, for his right to occupy spaces like this without question, and he would not be diminished. Not here. Not today. As he began walking toward the door, Marcus heard Stephen's voice behind him, but the words were meaningless. He didn't turn around. He had already made his stand, and it felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Marcus stepped out of the dealership, the heavy glass doors closing behind him with a soft thud, and the world outside seemed to breathe again. The sunlight, once a harsh reminder of his frustration, now felt warm and full of possibility. He had come to that place seeking validation, seeking a car that represented his success. But what he had found instead was something more valuable, a renewed sense of self-worth and integrity. The disappointment in the moment still stung, but it wasn't as sharp as it had been inside the showroom. It was more of a quiet anger, one that fueled his resolve. He didn't need the approval of people like Stephen to define his success. He had earned everything he had, not by conforming to anyone's expectations, but by being true to himself and his abilities. As Marcus walked across the parking lot to his car, his phone buzzed. It was a message from a colleague he had been working with on a business deal, a project he had poured his heart into. The message was brief, but carried weight. "We got the deal. It's official. Congratulations." Marcus stopped for a moment, reading the words over and over again. It was a significant victory, one that had taken months of effort, countless hours, and an unwavering belief in his own abilities. It was a reminder that his value wasn't tied to a car or a dealership, or even to the opinions of people who could not see past their biases. But as he read the message, something else became clear. This victory, this success, was no longer just for him. It was for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. For everyone who had been judged before they were even given a chance. It was a small, quiet rebellion against the forces that tried to diminish people based on their race, their background, or any other factor that had nothing to do with their worth. In the days that followed, the ripple effect of Marcus's decision began to take shape. Word of the incident at the dealership spread quickly, thanks to the subtle way Marcus had made his stand. People began to talk, not just about the incident itself, but about what it represented. It wasn't just about one salesman or one instance of discrimination. It was a reminder of how deeply ingrained these biases were in every corner of society, in the places where wealth and power often reigned unchecked. But the story didn't stop there. Marcus had been contacted by local media outlets, who wanted to hear about his experience and the message he hoped to send. It was an opportunity he hadn't expected, but it was one he knew he couldn't pass up. He agreed to an interview, and when the cameras rolled, he spoke not just about the wrongs he had faced, but about the larger systemic issues that affected so many others. He talked about his own journey, his own struggles, and how moments like this were often a part of a much larger pattern. His words were not just a personal account, but a call to action, an invitation for others to stand up and be heard, to challenge the injustices that too often went unnoticed or unspoken. The dealership, in the meantime, was not immune to the fallout. The story began to take on a life of its own, and as more people heard about it, the pressure mounted. Social media erupted with people voicing their support for Marcus and condemning the discriminatory behavior of the salesman. Customers began to share their own experiences of discrimination at the dealership, and before long the issue couldn't be ignored. The dealership's management was forced to respond, but their response only made things worse. Instead of acknowledging the problem and taking responsibility, they issued a statement that seemed more focused on damage control than on any real desire to change. The salesman, Stephen, was temporarily suspended, but the lack of a true apology or any effort to address the underlying issue left a sour taste. Marcus saw through it. He wasn't interested in corporate platitudes. What mattered to him was whether or not the organization was willing to truly reflect on their practices and make long-term changes. A few weeks later, Marcus received a formal letter from the dealership's CEO. It was an apology of sorts, one that acknowledged the incident and promised further training for staff members on diversity and inclusivity. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. The dealership offered him a discount on any car he chose to purchase, as a way to make amends, but Marcus declined. He wasn't interested in being compensated for his time or his experience. What he wanted was a meaningful change, one that would ensure that no one else would have to endure the same treatment he had. In the end, Marcus didn't buy the car he had originally set his sights on. He didn't need it to validate who he was or what he had achieved. He realized that the car, while a beautiful object, was not the true prize he was after. The real victory lay in his ability to stand up for himself, to make a stand that rippled through his community and beyond, inspiring others to do the same. As he drove away from the dealership for the last time, Marcus felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time he knew where he stood, and that was more than enough. The weeks that followed Marcus's decision to speak out were both empowering and exhausting. He had become a symbol, whether he liked it or not. His story was shared on social media, discussed in news outlets, and even sparked debates in community forums. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for the dealership, but for society at large. People saw Marcus as a man who refused to be silenced, someone who confronted systemic issues with courage and clarity. But even as he felt the weight of the support behind him, there was a growing tension, a storm on the horizon that he knew he would have to face. One morning, as Marcus sat in his office preparing for a meeting, he received a call from an unknown number. He picked up, expecting it to be a client or a colleague, but the voice on the other end was unfamiliar, sharp, and full of urgency. "Marcus Bennett?" the voice said. "Yes, this is he," Marcus replied, immediately sensing that something was off. "This is William Harris from the dealership's legal department. I am calling on behalf of Stephen, the salesman involved in your incident. We would like to discuss the matter further." Marcus sat back in his chair, a sense of unease settling over him. He had anticipated a call, but not one like this. He had hoped the issue would fade into the background after the media attention, but the fact that they were reaching out now, months after the event, made him uneasy. "What's this about?" Marcus asked. trying to mask the tension in his voice. "I believe you're aware of the coverage that followed the incident," William continued. "While the dealership has taken steps to address the issue, Stephen feels that the portrayal of events was inaccurate. He claims that his actions were misinterpreted, and as a result, he has filed a formal grievance against you for defamation. He's asking for an apology and, of course, expects compensation for the damage to his reputation." Marcus's heart dropped. He had expected many things, but this was the last scenario he had envisioned. A confrontation with the very person who had tried to undermine him. It felt like a betrayal, a reminder that even after all the progress he thought he'd made, there were still forces at play that sought to diminish his voice and strip him of the truth he had shared. "I see," Marcus said, his voice controlled but tinged with anger. "And what exactly do you expect from me? An apology? After everything that's happened? After everything he did?" There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before William responded, his tone shifting to something more transactional. "We would like to resolve this matter quickly and amicably, Marcus. A simple apology would go a long way in settling the situation. We're not looking to escalate this, but Stephen feels deeply wronged, and we'd prefer to handle this without involving the courts." The words hung in the air, heavy and calculated. Marcus knew exactly what this was, a calculated move to regain control of the narrative, to force him into submission, to erase the power he had gained by speaking out. The dealership had gone into damage control mode, but instead of acknowledging their mistakes and learning from them, they were trying to turn the tables on Marcus. For a moment, Marcus's mind raced. He felt the familiar sting of anger, the injustice of it all, but he also felt a quiet clarity settling in. This wasn't about Stephen anymore. This wasn't about the dealership or the cars or the reputation of a salesman. This was about something much bigger. The right to speak truth, to stand up when wronged, and to refuse to be silenced by those who thought they could wield their power over others. "No," Marcus finally said, his voice steady but resolute. "I won't apologize. Not for telling the truth, not for standing up for myself, and for others who have been treated the way I was. Stephen's actions were not misinterpreted. They were a reflection of the reality we face every day. And if he's willing to drag me through this, he can try. But I'm not going to let him or anyone else take my voice from me." William's response was quick, cold. "I'll relay your decision to Stephen and the board. But know this, we won't let this go. You've made your stance clear, and we'll be taking the next steps in pursuing this matter." The line clicked off, and Marcus sat there for a long moment, the weight of the conversation settling in. It was a defining moment in his journey, one that was going to cost him. He could feel that much in his gut. But there was also a strange sense of liberation in the air. He wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Later that week, the confrontation went public. The legal team at the dealership wasted no time in pursuing their case, but what they hadn't anticipated was the overwhelming support that Marcus would receive. The media, which had once given him a platform to speak his truth, now stood by him in his defense. His community rallied behind him, and even strangers who had never met him felt compelled to share their support. In the end, the pressure from both public opinion and legal counsel forced the dealership to reconsider their stance. After a few tense weeks, they dropped the defamation claim, publicly acknowledging that Stephen's behavior had indeed been inappropriate, and that the company was committed to addressing the deeper issues of racial bias within their organization. Marcus's victory wasn't just a personal one, it was a collective one, a testament to the power of speaking out, of standing firm in the face of adversity, and of refusing to let a single person's prejudice dictate your future. As Marcus walked out of the courthouse on the day the case was dismissed, he felt the weight of the fight lift off his shoulders. It had been a long, hard battle, one he hadn't fully anticipated, but it had brought him something valuable, the unshakable truth that his voice, his story, and his dignity could never be taken away from him again. The months that followed the legal confrontation were quieter for Marcus, but the echoes of what had happened in the dealership and the courtroom remained with him. He continued to carry the weight of the experience, but in a different way, one that had transformed him, deepened him, and solidified his resolve. The victory wasn't one of defeat for the dealership or the salesman, but one of affirmation for Marcus, for those who had stood beside him, and for everyone who had ever felt voiceless. Looking back, Marcus knew that he would never forget the way the dealership had treated him. The discriminatory actions that had set this journey in motion were still fresh in his mind, but he understood something now that he hadn't fully grasped before. Change wasn't something that could be legislated or forced through simply by the actions of one person or one organization. It came through people who were willing to confront the uncomfortable truths, to stand tall in the face of injustice, and to make their voices heard, even when the cost seemed too high. Marcus had taken a stand, and in doing so he had not only found his own strength, but had also given others the courage to do the same. He received messages from all over, from people of all backgrounds, who shared their own stories of discrimination, of standing up for themselves, of choosing integrity over fear. They told him how his decision had inspired them, how they had seen the bravery it took to speak out and had felt empowered to do the same in their own lives. That, Marcus realized, was the true victory. In the wake of the incident, the dealership did take some steps toward real change. There were workshops on inclusivity, more diverse hiring practices, and a genuine effort, albeit imperfect, to create a more equitable environment. But Marcus didn't care much for the surface-level changes. He understood that transformation needed to go deeper, into the hearts and minds of those who had been part of the problem. He wasn't naive enough to believe that systemic biases could be eradicated overnight, but he knew that every step forward, no matter how small, was part of a larger movement, a movement that had been set in motion by the simple act of standing up for what was right. As for Marcus, his life continued to evolve. He kept striving for success, but not at the expense of his integrity. He continued to excel in his business, but he had a newfound perspective on what true success meant. It wasn't about the things he could buy, the accolades he could collect, or the image he could project. It was about the relationships he built, the respect he earned, and the legacy he hoped to leave behind, a legacy of fairness, respect, and courage. And as he looked out over the horizon, Marcus knew that his journey wasn't finished. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, but there would also be more opportunities to make a difference. And with every step he took, he would carry the lessons he had learned from the dealership, from the courtroom, and from the people who had supported him along the way. He would continue to rise, to lead with integrity, and to stand firm in the face of adversity. Because in the end, Marcus had learned one undeniable truth. True strength came not from avoiding the fight, but from facing it head-on, with honesty, conviction, and a heart full of resolve. And that was the kind of man he was becoming, one who would never let anyone define his worth or his place in the world again.